Welcome to Single Subject Lesson Plan. This is one format. Every district may have their own. Every graduate school may have their own, but this is the one we're going to be using. When developing your lesson plan, you first need to start with a unit plan. In doing so, you need to go to the California Department of Education site, and there you're going to find the Common Core State Standards. What you're going to do is you're going to find your grade level, a subject, and then your particular content standards. What I would encourage you to do is download the entire state standards for your subject area, because what you really want to do is look at the scope and sequence of the entire year, map it out. But that's not the purpose of this video. I will discuss that in another video. So once you have your content standards, you should be able to choose a few. It could be 3, it could be 2, it could be as many as 5. But you want your lesson to focus on those content standards. Once you find your Common Core State Standards, you look at the entire year and you want to divide it up into units of study. Typically, the entire year should be approximately 5 or 6 units in the fall or 5 or 6 units in the spring. Once the units are divided up, choose one. And in there, you should be able to divide up into lessons. Your unit can consist of 1 week or 3 weeks or even more. Generally speaking, your unit of study should be able to answer all the questions of those content standards. For me, my units usually last about 2, 2.5, 3 weeks at the most, generally more than 1 week. And then you need to decide how many lessons. So usually for me, with one unit in 2.5 to 3 weeks, it's about 7 or 8 lessons. Are you ready? We're about to launch into a lesson plan. Remember to be patient with yourself, because the beauty is in the editing. You're going to get something out there, and then you're going to massage it with knowledge and information, more reflection, until you have a really good lesson plan. So remember, be patient and kind with yourself. I find the big idea and the essential questions probably the most difficult part of developing a lesson plan. Whatever big idea and essential questions you come up with, they can be included for all lessons. Your big idea is basically your big idea for a unit plan, and your essential questions will follow all the lessons. I will have an individual slide on big idea and essential questions later. But you will see, in general, the big idea is a universal core idea. So you should be able to come up with a big idea that represents a K-12 perspective of math, science, history, language arts, almost any topic. The essential question reflects back to the content standards, and you should be able to tell yourself, did I develop a question that is either right or wrong? Does it probe for more thinking? Anyway, I'm going to give you more information on this in a moment. Let's talk about the big ideas. I'm going to give you some information, and then we're going to look at the big ideas I have here. First of all, we have to remember that the K-12 education is actually a liberal arts education. It's a well-rounded one. That's why we don't necessarily focus exclusively on science, math, or even English. What we try to do is give a liberal arts education so all students leave the K-12 system of understanding math, science, English, history, and just being able to think, being able to make the connections not in silos but in integrated knowledge. A student will leave high school well-rounded, because the goal is to make connections between and within all subjects. The big idea specifically is to develop a conceptual framework for all learners. It tends to be abstract. In addition, I would say ask yourself, how does this subject or this particular content standard or this big idea of this lesson plan connect to the wider understanding of knowledge? And frankly, scope out and ask yourself, why is this important? How does this inform students and their education? Now let's look at these. It says equations can be solved in multiple yet equivalent ways. That's a math thing. Can you see that being answered in middle school and in high school? Look at the second one. How geographic features affect civilization? When students in the 4th grade make their missions, can you think about why the missions were along the Pacific coast? And then think about in U.S. history, where you have the development of the United States along waterways and good farming. Finally, look at the one that says music as a form of communication. When students learn music as a little child, when they play instruments, when they learn music in other subjects, especially at high school with choral and in band, is it not a form of communication? And how does singing and choral and band communicate information? When developing essential questions, know that there is no right or wrong answer. What you're trying to do is create an opportunity for students to probe for deeper meaning and purpose. So that's why you look here and you will see in each one of these, is there a right or wrong answer? Is there more than one answer? Does the question draw out the emotions and the intellect of the student? And finally, does it allow people to have a different answer when they gain more information? For example, how can a quadratic equation predict trends? Typically you learn that in high school, but think about it when you get to the college level, when you're getting more sophisticated equations, like in economics or in finance. How did the Arabian Peninsula influence a nomadic and sedentary lifestyle? Does that change over time? The question of how can be answered in multiple ways, and there's not a yes or no. It's not right or wrong. It actually probes questions. It probes answers. It probes reflection. And finally, how is the American dream portrayed in society? Well, doesn't that ask the question, which society? Which aspect of society? Are we talking about American culture society? Or can we talk about the South, the North, the Midwest, even the Pacific West? It can actually be answered by different people in different ways. That is an essential question. No right or wrong, but then it pauses you to think when given more information. This graphic illustrates my editing cycle. I first start out with the content standards. This is the Common Core State Standards. And from that, I develop my big idea. And from the big idea, my essential questions. And then from my essential questions, the learning objectives. But I find that it's not a linear kind of perspective. It's sort of circular, which you see here. I start with the content standards, I go to the big idea, and then I go to the essential questions, and I'm thinking, does that relate back to the content standards? Does it connect with the big idea? And so I may edit it. And then I go to my learning objectives. I do my ABCDs. And then I go back to my content standards, and I keep going around and around this cycle, and I keep editing until I feel comfortable that I have a big idea that connects to the larger body of knowledge, and that students will have questions that they can ask that don't have right or wrong answers, but engage in the big ideas. And finally, the learning objectives, which are much more linear. So what you're doing is, in learning objectives, is you're going to find your A, B, C, D, audience, behavior, condition, and degree. The learning context is a tricky one. It just depends on who you ask. So, ask. For me, I would like people to tell me what lesson is coming before, what lessons are coming after, sort of the perspective of where does this particular lesson fit in the unit. However, others may ask you to know more specifically about your students. What's your student background? What's the gender of the students in your class? What's their age, economic status? What's their prior knowledge? You can basically talk about the demographics of your classroom. Creating learning objectives at times can be the most difficult part of lesson planning. So there's a complete separate videos. So what I would suggest, if you want more information here, I would go to No More 2 Years Teaching, and there's a specific video on learning objectives. Instructional input is probably one of the most fun things I find about teaching. When I teach in a class for a period, I think from beginning to end, how am I going to create a learning experience from the anticipatory set, how I'm going to input instruction, whether direct, through either films, lectures, reading, it could be almost anything. But I also need to learn how to model the information so students understand how I'm going to be using it. Then, after I've modeled it, I need to check for understanding. Are my students grasping what I did? The next thing you get to do is guided practice, allowing students to work on their own with the information. And then independent practice is either they can do it the last few minutes of class, sometimes at home, creating a project. And then there's closure, the most important thing at the very end, to conclude your lesson. The anticipatory set or hook, depending on your methodology, is probably what I consider one of the most fun parts of teaching. What you're trying to do is capture the student's attention. I tend to show videos. You can also ask questions. You can show a picture. You can have them do an activity. Shouldn't take any more than about 5 minutes, but the goal is to capture the student's attention for the lesson. It engages them. It prompts their prior learning. It connects them to what you're going to be doing next. And so what you want to do, it's sort of like an invitation to the rest of the lesson. Here's one example. When I taught geometry, when we were starting geometric figures, we had 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional figures. So I showed a video on kite flying, and the kites had 2 dimensions, but they also had 3 dimensionals. From that experience, I was able to ask students, if you were going to design a kite, would you make a 2-dimensional? Would you make 3-dimensional? And then they were able to trigger and design their own kites using the information we learned for the next few weeks on 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional geometric figures. The most important thing in the meat of the lesson is the instruction. The question is, how are students going to gain knowledge? Oftentimes people lecture, but more recently you can have demonstrations, have students read texts, do WebQuest. You can even do it through Socratic discussion, thinking that the knowledge is in the room and it's the teacher's responsibility to ask questions to prompt understanding and information. But in essence, how is the new knowledge going to be communicated or discovered by students? Instructional strategies are the methods in which teachers impart knowledge to students. So it doesn't necessarily have to be lecture. There are all sorts of methodologies. Here are some listed. Also, it could be a variety of things. It could be part lecture, part graphic organizers, part posters, think, pair, share. There are all sorts of instructional strategies to have students not only engage, but connect with one another and connect with the information.